this is not just any other company. This is the corporate behemoth of the day, and cracking the anti-union shell of Amazon. I really do think that the effects of that would resound outward. But to your question, I think that one thing that's interesting about the present moment is that there's a lot of interest in organizing, but there's also very high public approval ratings of unions. And I think that people understand that there's an essential dynamic at work in American society where there are these corporate overlords that are holding people down. They don't know what to do about it. They tend to concentrate too much energy on the Epstein files, not enough on just like corporate power in the abstract. But I do kind of think that there's energy for that at this particular moment. I think it's also relevant that Amazon, as opposed to a company like Walmart, has a more affluent customer base. And so Amazon is really focused on urban centers, whereas a company like Walmart, it's more supplying basic goods to suburban and rural customers. I think a strike at Walmart really does hit at that dynamic that you're describing, where people are like, hey, this is where I get my groceries. Like, I can't afford groceries like at this other store. And so if you go on strike, this is a problem for me in particular. At Amazon, it's a little bit different.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, joined by George Hoare in London, co-host. Hello.
Correct. You are joined by me.
Excellent. And joined once again for, I don't know, is that the third appearance? Ben Fong?
That sounds right. Yeah. Hey guys, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, delighted to have you back. Ben, if you're not familiar, is editor at Damage and keeps a Substack on labor and logistics at ontheseams.substack.com. I'm going to mention a couple of different things as we go along, and as usual, all the links will be found in the show notes. But specifically, to elaborate a little bit before I kind of pass over to Ben, we're talking about moving things about logistics, about the people who work in logistics and the power they at least tacitly have. And then we're also going to move on to speaking about a specific means of moving things and people, that is the train, an avatar of modernity, perhaps the avatar of modernity. Ben and George have written the editorial to the forthcoming print issue of Damage magazine on trains. And we're going to be talking about why trains and why we're talking about trains today in the kind of second part of this episode. That issue contains things like, just to give a shout out to this one, we'll probably do more episodes on trains and some of the themes that arise from this issue on trains as the month and next 2 months kind of go on. But there's things like Ryan Zickraff on the 158-year story of the Steelton Mill's rise and eventual fall, and how he sees that as a grim object lesson in the fading strength of American industry. Paul Prescott on the history of organized labor activity in the railroad industry. We had the aforementioned editorial from Ben and George, which we're going to discuss today. There's me also on the history of Brazilian railways. I'm sure that has you salivating, listener. That'll be towards the end of this episode. Please do stick around despite my ironic comments about my own issue of interest. Anyway, we should get started properly. So on labor and logistics, people, Ben, who peruse your Substack will be struck with many articles entitled something like A Primer on X Company's Distribution Network. So what are these articles, firstly? Who are they for? And more broadly, what are you trying to do with On the Seams?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with the last question because it helps contextualize why I do these deep dives, these brief primers on the distribution networks of these big companies. I had been reading supply chain and logistics textbooks with a friend of mine, Scott Jenkins, who I started the Substack with. He works for Teamsters for a Democratic Union. And we had been thinking about a lot of things related to what we call like the logistical economy. I think that the more common understanding of today's economy is like a service economy or a deindustrialized economy. The idea being that after industrialization, There's deindustrialization and a move back to primarily service-focused economy. And that's not wrong, but if you look at the big corporations of the day, like the major employers in the United States, I think it's Walmart, Amazon, Target, Home Depot, and Kroger, all in that order. And they're all big retail outlets. They're all beneficiaries of globalization. So it's not just that we stopped making stuff; it's that we started importing stuff from abroad, and that has resulted in just a wildly new kind of distribution system within the states. And so part of what I was interested in the Substack, Scott and I were just figuring out what these distribution networks looked like, how they've changed over time, what kind of power they give the retailers that control them, and what it's doing to work as well in the warehousing and transportation sector. And the more we dug into it, the more we figured out that there's just not a ton of information out there for living in such a visible world. It's actually quite difficult to understand how these distribution networks operate for understandable reasons. The big retailers don't really advertise where their facilities are, what they do, how they get their product to stores, how they get their product to your doorstep. And so part of the project is just figuring out how it works, where the facilities are, what the facility differentiation looks like, what kind of automation is being deployed in these different facilities, how they're changing. And it's all kind of being driven by the case of Amazon, which is far and away the sort of automation leader in the warehousing sector. But every company is changing to meet the moment. I think that there's a real desire to figure out what digital retail looks like, even agentic retail in the new age of AI. And so as a result, all the retailers are changing stuff up, opening new kinds of facilities, experimenting with different distribution models. And so things are changing. I'm just trying to keep track of what's going on, really.
I mean,
So-
it's kind of cool. Ben will chuckle at this, I suspect, but it's quite fun, some of these primers, because there's lots of maps and infographics and things like that. So I think that's quite fun. I don't know if everybody's of the same opinion,
I
but
think everyone. Why would you not find that fun? You've got an infographic, you've got a map.
Yeah.
Ben, I did want to just ask a bit of a follow-up, maybe two-part follow-up. The first part, are you a seamster? Because this is like a teamster and a scenester. You don't have to answer that. But what actually are the seams and why are they important?
Yeah. So one of the big inspirations for Scott and I was this guy named John Womack, who has been working on this longer book that's actually been published in Spanish, but not in English, about technical connections in different industries. He did this interview with the labor organizer Peter Olney called Labor, Power, and Strategy. It's a great book. I highly recommend it to everyone. It's just an interview that Peter and Glenn Parashek did with John Womack a few years back. And it's got some responses from labor leaders today. And Womack's basic argument is that labor power is situated. We tend to think of labor and capital as involved in this grand battle for supremacy, and that this is the sort of central antagonism of any capitalist society between labor and capital. And that's true, but what Womack wants to say is that it's not just that the workers get together and express their associational power and overcome the boss. It's that they have to be smart about it, and they have to leverage the technical connections in their favor to do so. So one particular example that's close to my heart is in the CIO moment when the UAW was first forming and they were trying to organize General Motors, which at that point was the largest employer of the day, the kind of template organization of corporate capitalism. When they were organizing General Motors, they picked out strategic facilities. And so they had sat in on many different buildings in the Flint plant in December 36, and then going into January 37. But the strike had sort of stalled out. They weren't sure what the governor was going to do. And then I would say the decisive moment in the strike really came when they figured out how to occupy the engine building, GM Plant 4, And once they did that, they sort of stopped the production of engines altogether, and GM just couldn't make cars. And that's an example of a seam, according to Womack. It's a choke point in the process of production that when workers occupy it, when they have control over it, when they have leverage over it, the company just can't do anything. So it's beyond just withdrawing your labor power from the process. It's about exercising control over the labor process. And Womack wants to say that when labor is successful, not just in small ways, but on the grand scale, it's really thinking about these technical connections. And Womack wants to say that every technical system, no matter how powerful, is going to have these seams. And in fact, the more powerful and more complex it becomes, the more seams there are to take advantage of. But you have to understand how these things work and where they're vulnerable in order to do so. My argument, I think, one of the assumptions behind the Substack is that that's becoming a more and more complicated process, figuring out where those seams are. In the case of, all the big employers at mid-century in the States, GM, Ford, GE, US Steel, we're talking about companies with an enormous amount of fixed capital in specific places where if you could shut down that factory or one specific section of that factory, you could have enormous structural power in the workplace. And again, these were the big, the big employers of the day. And so they sort of set the labor standards of the day. Today, in the modern logistical economy, there's no center, as it were. Like there's no one factory to go occupy. There's all these technical connections between distribution networks that are very important, but any one particular distribution node is not that important to a company. And so in the case of Amazon, for instance, if you are lucky enough to organize one of their big fulfillment centers and actually strike and disrupt operations there, they have the capacity to route packages around that fulfillment center and to just keep the operation humming without much impact to their business. So in that kind of scenario, occupying the factory, as it were, just doesn't do the same thing as it did at mid-century. And so the question today, I think, is given the fact that we're dealing with a networked kind of power rather than a place-specific kind of power, how do you take advantage of that? How do you disrupt the network, the flow of packages, rather than just individual sites?
No, I think that's really, really nicely put. That kind of, I guess, strategic element. Where do you collectively have leverage? But anyway, Alex, I think you had a question about the CIO period, which is not the CIA period. It's important to differentiate these two.
It's the same periods, yeah.
Okay, same period.
No, it's predates. CIO predates the CIA. Anyway, but without getting lost in alphabet soup of acronyms, I did want to say, firstly, just the what you provide on the seams is quite neat. Also, just because I think we assume that a lot of data is free and out there, that information is to be found, and often it's proprietary. It's hidden behind, it's stuff that companies own and have, and it's quite hard to get that information from them. I mean, I've worked on research projects where you have to go and interview people, talk to people who've previously worked there. Otherwise, you don't get that information. Or even if it is publicly available, it isn't collated in one place. So you can go, actually, how does Walmart kind of organize its logistics? Where are these key sites for distribution and so on? So I think it is quite neat to see that all pulled together on the seams. It also, just a comment before I get onto my question, because I think it might inform some of the discussion as we go forward, is that this ties into kind of what seems to be a kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong, a key contradiction, where if we look back to the kind of period of the 1930s, you had hugely concentrated sites of production, very place-based, as you mentioned, Ben. As we go forward in time through to today, capital becomes ever more centralized and concentrated, ever more monopolistic, oligopolistic, etc. And at the same time, production becomes much more dispersed than it was previously. So it's almost like these two kind of trains passing in the night, to adapt a saying. And I think that's something which I guess you're trying to tussle with.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when we talk about the economy becoming more decentralized, there's something incorrect about that, in that corporate concentration of power is higher than it's ever been, and just in terms of sheer employment numbers, Walmart 1.6 million workers in the US, Amazon 1.1. That's not even counting its like third-party driver service. And so these are huge employers comparable to the GMs and GEs of the day. So in that level, I think you're right where to talk about economic decentralization is not exactly right. And I think that there is understandable concern about labor's ability to take advantage in this kind of situation where there aren't those sort of stores of fixed capital in the same way. As one example, that I think Amazon wanted to resound throughout the labor world. So in Quebec, there was a warehouse that unionized a year and a half ago, 2 years maybe. And in response to the unionization of this warehouse, Quebec labor law is much better than in the US. They were sort of forced into negotiation. And so Amazon decided not only to close that particular warehouse, but to close their entire operation in the entire province of Quebec. So it's a real kind of Kaiser Soze move. Just like, you want to unionize one warehouse, we're going to shut down the whole thing. And that was, I think, it's very concerning, this idea that, you put in a ton of work to talk to workers, to have those organizing conversations, to get to an election, and then they just cut bait on not only that operation, but everything in the whole province. It's a testament to how difficult it is to take advantage of the network connections that these retailers depend upon. That being said, and part of the reason that we do the research on the seams is that there are new kinds of technical connections that do make these companies vulnerable. So, as just one example, there was an AWS outage not that long ago, a couple of months back. I teach at ASU, and we couldn't use any of our course shells because we all rely on AWS. But also
That's
rely
Amazon
on
Web
AWS
Services for
Amazon's own distribution network. They depend upon AWS to be able to route packages on any given day. And so I had delivery drivers sending me pictures of their delivery stations where people are just kind of milling about, kicking stuff around, not really do anything. And it's because once AWS goes down, Amazon can't deliver any packages. And this is a new kind of thing. Like, this is a new kind of vulnerability introduced by Amazon's own complexity, and it allows them to get around the traditional strongholds of organized labor in one way. But if we did find ways to take advantage of this very fragile system that they've built, I think labor could exercise a tremendous amount of power over the new technical connections that they've made.
Yeah, no, I mean, you make the comparison with the period of the late 30s into the early 40s when the CIO was able to conquer all the strategic points of production in the industrial society of the era. And at the same time, you recognize that everything is radically different today, and that we shouldn't kind of try to repeat the past, and that there isn't any going back, but at the same time that there is one big lesson: go after the big targets and disrupt their operations until they recognize the union. So as a way of trying to put that into action, you discuss Amazon as being the priority. So in an essay in Jacobin, you write that every era has an iconic labor struggle that is both situated in a leading industry of its day and representative of the broader fortunes of labor. So maybe you could elaborate as to why Amazon. What makes it vulnerable? What makes it important? What makes it maybe symbolically important or even materially important?
I think there's a few reasons why Amazon. The first is simply that there's existing activity amongst organizers at Amazon. There are people who are assaulting different facilities. These are quote unquote inside organizers, people who work at Amazon facilities who are trying to organize from the inside. There's just a lot of outside activity as well. There's interest in organizing Amazon. It's in the news. And so I think there's already an extant network of both staff and inside organizers at Amazon, meaning that we don't need to recreate the wheel. We don't need to start something from scratch. There's something there to build on. I think that's very important as a starting point. The other thing I would say is that there's no other large corporation that so imposes on different union jurisdictions. And so the Teamsters are the obvious union to organize Amazon, the Teamsters being the sort of warehousing and transportation union in the United States. But, Amazon has a new grocery play, a sort of same-day grocery delivery play in the United States. They also own Whole Foods. This is a threat to the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, the big grocery union in the country. They have Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon Healthcare, a threat to National Nurses United, SEIU. They are going after the entire parcel market, and it's projected that they're about to outdo the U.S. Postal Service by 2028 in terms of package volume. And so the postal unions are threatened by Amazon as well. I think for all these reasons, it's a kind of all-in moment for labor. That there are so many different unions affected, and Amazon is growing so quickly that this is going to be this is a kind of existential crisis for labor. If they can't deal with Amazon, then I just have a really difficult time seeing any reversal in the union density trend in the US. And so in that sense, yeah, I do kind of think the CIO moment for how different it was does provide some inspiration in that the CIO leaders understood very clearly that labor would not have a seat at the political table until the big employers were organized. And so you only go after employers on the margins, you're going to remain a marginal power. You go after GM, you go after Ford, you go after US Steel, all of a sudden you're going to have a seat at the political table writ large. And I think something like that is true today. If we avoid Amazon, but also Walmart, Target, Home Depot, Kroger, et cetera, we're avoiding the organizations that really set the labor standards for the modern day. And if labor doesn't want to have big fights, then it's going to continue to lose.
Mm. I find that very compelling. I wanted to get into how this actually works and where you're targeting, right? Because a lot of this is about targeting specific points in the production or distribution process. You note that what Amazon truly cares about is package flow. And so getting control over that package flow is critical. And as you've mentioned, that refers to understanding of the way that Amazon and these other kind of companies work, is that they work on a network rather than a site-specific form of organization. You set up two criteria for identifying a strategic choke point, and it'd be interesting to kind of play this out and see, okay, what kind of thing does work and what kind of thing doesn't work according to the criteria you set up. So firstly is that the node that one would be considering to target would serve a critical role in the larger distribution system, and two, that labor is capable of impacting it through disruptive action. Now you read that and I think, well, yeah, that sounds pretty straightforward, but then you work through ways in which certain places might tend to one criteria but not to another. So maybe you could talk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, that was that example was conceived specifically with Amazon in mind, and I can provide two examples there. So the Teamsters in their organizing efforts in the U.S. have been focused on two kinds of nodes: delivery stations and air hubs. Air hubs, I think, are obvious. If you can't move air hubs are tremendously complicated arrangements, and once you've established operations there, it's just very expensive to try to move it. So they have active organizing campaigns at KCVG, which is Amazon's main air hub in Cincinnati, as well as KSVD in San Bernardino. It's kind of a secondary air hub, and that sort of I think is pretty obvious why there. The other main focus of the Teamsters is delivery stations. And I think that there's a lot of good arguments for that. You can disrupt operations at a delivery station in order to stop the flow of packages to particular zip codes. The associational networks of drivers tend to be much richer than those of warehouse workers who are more atomized and out in the suburbs and rural areas. Drivers in more urban concentrated areas tend also to associate with, UPS drivers who are unionized. They understand what the pay rates are at other companies. And so there's just a much sort of richer associational environment for organizing drivers. And they're smaller as well. So delivery stations, maybe 2, 3, 500 people at most. But it's a workforce where you can sort of imagine getting everyone together to disrupt the operations. And I think there's good reason for focusing on delivery stations. My argument would be that there's just a lot more they could do to work up the chain as well to maximize the impact of any particular delivery station strike. And I think the Teamsters know this very well. At different sortation centers, which are the sort of upstream facility from delivery stations. If you can picket those facilities at the same time that you have a strike at a delivery station, you're going to be impacting a whole region as opposed to just a few set of zip codes that the delivery stations focused on. So that's, I guess, an example of working from the ground up where you have a site that you can disrupt and figuring out how to maximize the disruptive impact of that action. I think on the other side of the equation would be something like a fulfillment center. Amazon fulfillment centers are widely, they're almost iconic for the company.
These are the places where people put things in the boxes and send them out to be.
They are, yeah. So they will, put them in inventory. These are the places that are highly automated. They have those Kiva, Roomba robots everywhere. And so they pick your package, they package it up, and they send it outbound. Usually it takes them like 15 minutes to do so after you click an order. These are, number one, it's really difficult organizing terrain. Most people at their particular workstations are really atomized. And so you're just sitting at a station, packing boxes all day, or picking stuff from inventory or stowing it in inventory. So it's a really difficult workforce to organize. The other problem with fulfillment centers is that Amazon has so many of them at this point, and they're so well networked that if you did, gather together, a good number of people, these are facilities at which 3,000-4,000 people work, right? So they're huge facilities. But even if you were lucky enough to gather enough people together for an efficient and effective strike, Amazon can just route packages around that fulfillment center. They have the capacity to just, pick up, just boost operations elsewhere and barely feel the impact over, especially, 3-4 day strike. That is barely going to register in Amazon's system.
Right.
So it's understanding what you can and can't do within the network. And that requires, like I said, an understanding of those techniques.
Yeah, I just, hearing you talk about that, I guess my question was like, how optimistic or pessimistic are you? How bleak is the situation here? Just because hearing you kind of describe it makes sense for it to be a strategy of capital to have reduced dependence on any one individual choke point or seam and to atomize workers as much as possible. There's obviously a whole load of kind of ideological elements as well, which we don't necessarily need to go into unless you think they're interesting. But is this the future of work if you have the central logic of work being one about capital versus labor? Because I think there's been a lot of talk recently about the changes in labor due to AI, but it seems like there's a really fundamental logic here, which is that this is the strategy of capital to make labor less powerful. Like why all other things being equal is this not going to kind of accelerate and grow in the future?
Sure. So on that last point, I have a few different articles out recently. Maybe you could link them in the show notes or something about automation at Amazon, both on the blue and white collar side of the workforce. I think in terms of Amazon, warehouse automation game, the idea that they're going to have quote unquote dark warehouses that are fully automated that don't have human workers, I think it's kind of ridiculous. Amazon's displacing work all the time through various robotics upgrades, and you don't tend to see it because the company's growing so fast. And so the workforce is growing more slowly than their revenue. So they're displacing work all the time, but I think that their workforce is actually going to continue to grow because they do need actual people in the warehouses to make them function. On the white collar side, it's a little bit different, but that's a different dynamic. We can talk about it if you want. I'm very optimistic, provided that people are clear about the necessary conditions under which a successful campaign on Amazon could take place. And I think that right now we're trying to throw spare parts at the problem. And that's not a disservice to the organizers involved in Amazon organizing. I think that this is an incredibly dedicated and strategic and capable bunch of organizers that's involved in the Amazon organizing project. I just mean that the resources available to organize this company are a fraction of what they need to be in order to pose a credible threat. The CIO came out and they said, okay, how are we going to organize US Steel? I don't know, but here's $11 million, $11 million in like 1930s money to go do it, right?
Mm.
That you kind of need that kind of thing. You need institutional labor, not just like, labor activists on the ground, but institutional labor to say, this is an existential problem for us. Our power is going to go away in the next decade completely. And it's already politically diminished quite considerably, but it's going to go away. We're going to reach some kind of event horizon point unless we commit resources to new organizing. And as I've argued elsewhere, like the money is there, like both in reserves, but also in terms of like, how they could differently spend their expenditures. It's just a question of actually committing those resources. And if we got to that point, if labor said, okay, this is a multi-million-dollar campaign over like a decade, I'm very optimistic about it. But until the commitment and resources are there, the idea that we're going to just scale from what we have to what we need to have seems kind of fanciful to me.
Right. No, and you point out, to move on to talk about the politics maybe more directly, that unions have this money to spend. They're going to spend $500 million, I think you say, on the midterms, but that's, you're not going to have a huge amount of impact, and there's little point in it anyway, and you could be spending it on something else.
Well,
Now,
just a small point on
yeah.
that. So the Center for Working Class Politics, which is associated with Jackman Magazine, and the Center for Work and Democracy, which I work for, we just put out a report together about union electoral candidates, and it's mostly about how unions can run their own members for office better. But there's an introductory section about unions' political expenditures, and as you said, every 2 years it's at about $500 million. And in 2024, I think it was significantly over $500 million, but it's right around there for the last decade or so. But one interesting thing we found is that that number has decreased as a percentage of total political contributions, right? Just because you've got these like PACs and rich individuals donating money, which is to say labor is spending the same amount, but the effect of its political contributions has been decreasing significantly in the last decade. So I think there's a good argument to make, especially in these upcoming midterms when the political winds are in the Democrats' favor. Does labor really need to spend $500 million on a midterm election when it could have other priorities that would better suit its interests?
Yeah, and so to talk about political objectives. Now, I mean, I don't want to sound overly critical, because any of us would, I think, take a revival in unionism, whatever other conditions were attached to that, you'd kind of roll the dice on that and go, yeah, I'll take that. I'll take that deal. So I don't want to seem too critical, but what is firstly the goal? I mean, is it union recognition? That's the kind of horizon of what you're saying here, and then that would be kind of rolled out for all workers within that company, within that industry. I mean, how does this play out if all goes well, as it were?
Whew, I mean, that's a big question. I think that there's a way in which labor, like a true labor upsurge, has been lost to memory. It's been multiple generations since like we've actually seen it in the kinds of effects that it has on society.
Oh, to be clear, I'm not talking about a general labor upsurge. I'm saying about the kind of more strategic
just organizing
thing that you're
Amazon
proposing. And organizing Amazon, and particularly demonstrating control and power over these strategic chokeholds.
Well, I mean, to go back to the CIO moment for a second, GM and the UAW signed a one-page document in, I think it was February 1937, that didn't promise anything. It just basically said, GM recognizes the UAW to be the bargaining representative of these specific units. Right? That's all it said. It's a one-page document. A month later, because they're freaked out by the sit-down strike, U.S. Steel signs an agreement with the CIO. And throughout the rest of that year, you get copycat sit-down strikes in all sorts of other industries. And it's because there's certain examples in society that are going to create a stir beyond their particularities. And I think that Amazon is one of those things. I think that what would be possible after a company like Amazon is organized, the field will just open up, I think. And it's because the idea that a company like Amazon can be brought to heel is really inspiring to a lot of people. And I think that there's the idea out there that people want to organize Amazon, that they want to see someone like Jeff Bezos and Andy Jassy, like they want to see them controlled and reined in some way, right? And this would be a concrete exercise in doing so. I think the political imagination really opens up if you can do something like this. I know it's just the unionization of one company, but it's a template organization for the moment, and I think that it just opens a lot of doors.
Just quickly to kind of jump in here from a kind of British perspective. I mean, I think the one union today that really exercises its leverage power or its ability to kind of operate on the at the seams or on the seams or control the seams is the RMT, which is the Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers Union. I mean, this is potentially a good segue to what we're talking about later. And I think why would I raise this? I think the amount of ideological backlash that, particularly the Evening Standard, which is was a free London paper, would give out to the RMT. So the RMT would organise a strike on the tube, the London Underground, and this would be very disruptive. But it would also show that is actually some leverage, not in exactly what we're talking about here, but more in people moving around London. And then it would be like, oh, the Evening Standard would be like, oh, why are all these RMT workers always striking? They've got such good pay and good kind of holiday and entitlements anyway. And it was like, well, yeah, that's probably why they have this good pay and these good holiday entitlements, because they do use their leverage well. But yeah, I just think I think there is something about having an iconic, potentially like an iconic struggle or union or like location. And I think Amazon feels like not necessarily the American equivalent of the RMT and the London Underground, but something a bit more potentially even global, but even larger than that, because exactly as you were saying, Ben, like Amazon is this very clear representative of the billionaires. I was going to put on my Bernie Sanders voice there, but I decided against it. Probably listeners will be glad of that. But I just think there is something about this, everything that you've said, kind of not tying it together, but it is crucial that there is some almost like wider view of like here is the labor, the particular like labor struggle that could be iconic or could be symbolic in a way, and it does feel like Amazon really is the one to concentrate on because of all the reasons that you said.
Yeah, I mean, two things, and this might be one differing context between the U.S. and the U.K. There was a similar. The longshore contract was up recently on the West Coast, and longshoremen are, like rail workers in the UK, are very well paid. They've got good contracts. They make six-figure salaries, right? They're quote unquote like privileged blue collar workers. And that was the line coming out of the Maritime Association, right? Like these are privileged workers who are holding things up, like really trying to stir up some animosity towards towards the longshoremen. And I just feel like it falls flat in the U.S. Like the idea that blue collar workers are somehow empowered over our corporate bosses to control things in the economy. I don't think it works in the way that it used to in the U.S. And specifically in the case of Amazon, it's just really hard. It's a really hard narrative to push. I mean, Amazon's very good about paying people a little bit more in any particular market than competitors do, so that they can have control over the labor force in the way they want. They want to be able to scale up and scale down, like to their own desires. And so they're very particular about saying, okay, in this zip code, how much are warehousing workers getting paid? How much would we need to offer in order to scale up by 5,000 workers on this particular day? They're very conscious about that kind of thing. But the idea that they're a good employer is just farcical to most of the American population. Yeah. I mean, a lot of Amazon, I've got a separate research project where I'm just interviewing Amazon warehouse workers and talking about their lives. Just a lot of people are on Medicaid. Like even if they're offered Amazon benefits, they choose not to be. Sometimes they have odd part-time contracts that don't allow them Amazon benefits, even though they were promised when they first started, and so they have to turn to state benefits. I mean, just the number of people who are working at Amazon full-time, but also getting food stamps, Medicaid, housing assistance, et cetera, is pretty remarkable. And so I think just this narrative of privileged workers, it it would never sort of work in any campaign on Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, that to a large degree preempts the final question I had about this, which is this presumes a sort of unbalanced sort of unionization, and particularly as it would, as it would kind of roll through at the early stages of it, it'd be primarily focused on workers with the sort of leverage in the distribution centers to really have impact on the company. And you can imagine a strike in those areas, which would cause widespread disruption and would really impact the company and would force to reckon with the union. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who maybe live in communities who don't have Amazon workers, who might otherwise feel sympathetic to Amazon workers, but who otherwise only feel the disruption at that point in time, and would, I think, I suppose that raises political questions in the sense of kind of winning people over and how you see that playing out, right? Because I think that imposes a lot of, in a way that sort of the organic or an automatic form of solidarity might not be present. Because you're talking about these quite specific workers who are able to hold things up, and the propaganda open goal that provides the capitalist class.
I mean, just was one thing, before I address that question, just one thing about Amazon being, like the uneven unionization question, Amazon just being like one company. I really think there's something particular, not just about the organizing efforts at Amazon, but about Amazon itself. I mean, right now in the U.S., it's the largest private parcel company. It surpassed UPS. It's the largest cloud computing company. It's the second largest retailer by revenue after Walmart. I mean, it's all of these things at the same time, and it's growing into grocery, healthcare, pharmacy, supply chain writ large. It's doing supply chain by Amazon. It's just metastasizing in every direction. And I charted it out on its current growth course. If it saw the same growth in 2025 over the next couple of years, by 2028, it will be the first company to make $1 trillion in annual revenue. This is not just any other company. This is the corporate behemoth of the day, and cracking the anti-union shell of Amazon. I really do think that the effects of that would resound outward. But to your question, I think that one thing that's interesting about the present moment is that there's a lot of interest in organizing, but there's also very high public approval ratings of unions. And I think that people understand that there's an essential dynamic at work in American society where there are these corporate overlords that are holding people down. They don't know what to do about it. They tend to concentrate too much energy on the Epstein files, not enough on just like corporate power in the abstract. But I do kind of think that there's energy for that at this particular moment. I think it's also relevant that Amazon, as opposed to a company like Walmart, has a more affluent customer base. And so Amazon is really focused on urban centers, whereas a company like Walmart, it's more supplying basic goods to suburban and rural customers. I think a strike at Walmart really does hit at that dynamic that you're describing, where people are like, hey, this is where I get my groceries. Like, I can't afford groceries like at this other store. And so if you go on strike, this is a problem for me in particular. At Amazon, it's a little bit different. I mean, Amazon's not a grocery store exactly. It more operates as a convenience store where people get one or two things per order. And so if that pipeline shuts down, I do kind of think consumers are going to be a little less impacted than strikes at other retailers. So I do think that there's some structural features there that would make the Amazon consumer base more amenable to strike activity and disruption. Also them just being more affluent and being able to procure stuff from other places besides Amazon. But I would just point to the real hunger for organization at this particular period, and also the fact that the public's very sympathetic to unions. I mean, much more sympathetic than they've been in the past. And I think that that's largely a result of just the, runaway inequality in the country and the fact that the egregiousness of corporate power is on display every day.
All right, very good. Let's turn to trains now. Well, why trains? So we have this damage issue coming out on trains. I think probably a lot of us like trains. Probably people listening I suspect like trains, like traveling by train, like the idea of a whole country connected up by rail, especially high speed rail. And this is probably very strongly felt, especially in those places where that isn't available, or where the rail network is way less than it should be, like in the country like the US or even in Brazil. So despite that, and resisting the urge to be a kind of train fetishist, be like, this is amazing. Yeah, okay, but why? Why is it important to talk and think about trains?
Well, a friend of mine said that we're trying to corner the market in autistic socialists, and I said, yes, that's exactly what we're doing. No, I mean, to let Bunga listeners in on a little bit of the behind the scenes action at Damage, we had been talking about different issued ideas, and we'd come down to smells or trains, and I said, I don't know if I can edit an issue about smells. I think it's as simple as that.
It stinks. No, sorry, go on.
It didn't pass the sniff test.
It would be a lot of that, exactly. No, I think that that trains in a lot of different ways, as our editorial introduction gets to, represent the promise of modernity. And today they represent the broken promises of modernity. And so there's still some real nostalgia attached to trains. And even the way people talk about high-speed trains today, you know, in the West or in China, people have a kind of romanticism about what they make possible. And so we wanted to capture some of that, both the decay side, what deindustrialization has wrought, specifically through the example of trains, but also some of the romance of what they still imply.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is well said. I'd add to that probably there is something about the train as a kind of abstract idea of historical progress. The kind of, you know, depending on your political kind of background or inclinations, but the train is the locomotive of history. The train is like, you know, because it runs on these, I mean, listeners will probably know this, it runs on these tracks. It has a definite destination. There is something quite compelling about this. If you add in the, I don't know, the steam billowing in the kind of 19th century paintings of Turner and Manet, this, you know, there is something about this engine of progress, this kind of symbol of moving forward, and moving forward in a kind of undistractable, or I don't know what the right word would be, but like in a car you can take a wrong turn. In a train you can't. This is, and you know, if we're collectively making the tracks, then this is something that's potentially quite compelling. I mean, I don't want to kind of overstate it. I think in fact the point that Ben made is probably the most important one, which is that from today's vantage point, the train is almost like, unlike the flying car, we talked about flying cars with Lee Phillips and hoverboards, like that was the image of the future that we didn't have, but the train was the image of the future that we actually did have. It was always supposed to supersede itself by becoming ever more high speed, ever more reliable and comfortable, but it hasn't done that. I mean, I'm speaking from a country where we do have trains, but they are not ever faster. There's no high speed link between London and Birmingham. There's no like bullet trains that we can go everywhere in the UK virtually costlessly and extremely comfortably. I mean, it's we still I think have that same horizon, the train horizon, if that isn't too much of a kind of confusing metaphor. And we're still like, I think that's often what it is. That it's it's a nostalgia for when we had a past with a better future.
Yeah, though, I mean, people can look at China, Japan, France, Spain, be like, well, you know, they've got great high-speed rail, and indeed, people in those countries might, if you present those people in those countries with that question, they might kind of go, well, but we do have it, and it's good. You know, it should be cheaper, but we have it, so they have the future. What's the problem?
Be cheaper. It should be cheaper. I think that's the point. It should be universal as well. That was always the point. That it's not just there's a few examples of it in certain countries, but that it is something which is you know, continental or transcontinental, or like, you know, why trains across the sea or under the sea, like why these things, why do we not have them? This I guess is the challenge of the train, if you want to put it that way. Like why are these things not already with us? Because that would have been the line of progress.
The issue closes with an interview with Dan Wong about their Chinese high speed rail build out, and part of what he makes clear in that interview is that it's not just about rail, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're interested in the issue. Yes, there's that connotation of forward progress and modernity. But just from a developmental standpoint, I think that what he finds interesting about the train build out in China from the Chinese state's perspective is just that it's about capacity building. It's about having a broad developmental vision and showing your population that you can do things. And so beyond the specific infrastructure of rail, it's just about pointing in the direction of a infrastructurally and technologically better future. I think that's really, really important. It's just the symbol of the train.
Two other things which the train represents, or which are definitely connected to trains, which are not kind of these highfalutin ideas of modernity, progress, experience of space and time. One of them is the train spotter. So this is maybe this is a particularly British thing. I don't think this ended up making the cut in the editorial introduction, but it's something that I did want to give a nod to, not least because there is obviously the film, all that idea of the train spotter got a double meaning after Danny Boyle's massively popular 90s film, which is an adaptation of Irving Welsh's book. And in that, train spotting is not the previous practice from the 1940s of going and having a thermos of Bovril. Like, international listeners will have no idea what Bovril is. It's like tea but made with beef.
It's a stock cube in water, basically.
Yeah, it's very, very salty, very unhealthy. You watch lower league football while you're drinking it, or spot trains, tick them off the list that you have. But of course, Danny Boyle's reference to this was about heroin. Anyway, so train spotting has been connected in British popular culture for a long time with a certain sort of nerdish ness, an affinity with timetables and an enjoyment of things being quite predictable. But Rod Stewart's a train spotter, apparently, or maybe he's a model train enthusiast. There are lots of people who are interested in this, I guess, aspect of trains. Yeah, so there is another kind of, I guess, and you kind of maybe alluded to this at the beginning, Ben, that trains have a kind of pop cultural meaning or valence, if that would be the right way to put it. And that maybe is another symbol or another kind of aspect of, like, to what extent is this mode of transport romanticized? Because obviously we have romanticizations of car travel, of train travel, of plane travel, although plane travel perhaps a bit less so since Concorde was retired. So I think it does kind of tend to symbolize, or tend to kind of stand in for particularly consumer travel, like maybe less directly connected to the movement of goods, but it is that freeing up of space for people to travel throughout the nation, and potentially further as well. So I think there's a lot of I mean, smells also would have been a good issue as well. I think you could pack a lot into smells, although you'd have to have all kinds of scratch and sniff kind of things on the print issue. It would have been a whole kind of performance.
That's the technological frontier. The technological frontier we never really broached. The transmission of sight and sound. Yes, sure, but what about the transmission over long distances of smell? That's something humanity has not yet conquered.
Smell vision. Yeah, I mean, why is this podcast only? Why aren't listeners kind of not injecting in their nose? Why isn't there kind of an attachment where they not can smell us, but they can smell like now it'd be like you can smell a railway station. Wow, you can smell an Amazon warehouse. Brilliant.
Those special
smells and trains,
right? Yeah, transmit those special BungaCast pheromones. Get you hooked on the podcast. So, but I do think more seriously about the trains question is that, as we discussed in the recent Reading Club episode on the progress or lack thereof of technological advance, at least with regard to transport infrastructure, there hasn't been any great breakthrough. There's actually been just steps backwards in terms of space flight, and particularly in terms of supersonic aviation, which was a step forward. And then people, both the UK and France and the Soviet Union, kind of rolled back on Soviet. On supersonic flight. I think maybe in that context, where we don't really have very much new in transport infrastructure, modes of transport, you could make an argument perhaps about self-driving cars and about electrification. But it's not a great breakthrough in speed at any rate, which was the way it was traditionally measured, or its speed and the capacity to transport huge amounts of people. And it's not a great breakthrough in that regard. You could argue that, well, actually, maybe it does make a lot of sense to invest in rail. And there's another thing, which is I hint at this in my article about the history of Brazilian rail, which is that in some ways, it's often not economically justifiable. Certainly high-speed rail is not economically justifiable in its own terms. That building that one rail line that's under consideration will often not prove economically viable unless there's a huge amount of traffic between them, and maybe the cost of it will be less attractive for consumers than flying between the two or driving between the two places. So it's almost like it only makes sense, the build out of rail infrastructure, in a kind of if you build it first, then the people come sort of thing, or if you build it, they
people
will
might
come,
be quite excited by railway,
but it's premised on a punt.
Reaction.
It has to be premised on a punt of
that's the
much more economic activity.
So that's the spectacular element, I think, of any kind of developmentalist project to a certain extent. And I actually did want to ask you to give us a bit of potentially a bit more on this, Alex. Because in the piece you kind of describe Brazilian rail as iconic and idealized, though deserving neither. Like, what role did railway play in Brazil's development?
So, I mean, Brazil basically has no passenger rail. What it does have is kind of some urban rail connections. But, there's been talked about since the late 80s, and really in the lead up to the 2014 World Cup and 2016 Olympics, the idea of connecting Sao Paulo and Rio by high-speed rail. And, these are massive places, right? These are larger. These are megalopolises whose kind of greater metropolitan area is larger than most countries. Sao Paulo is 23 million people. Rio is 14 million people in the metro areas, and it's not connected. And they're it's 400 kilometers apart. It'd be quite easy to connect the two, and it still hasn't happened. And I think there's a sense in Brazil. There's often these kind of questions you can even search for. Why does Brazil not have rail? And I often was wondering this. I was like, well, this is ridiculous, And on top of it, let alone my desire to travel quickly between state capitals by rail rather than having to fly, there's something more important, even in terms of capital itself, which is like, well, it'd be far more efficient if more goods were transported by rail in Brazil than by road, as they currently are. That's a massive kind of bottleneck in kind of economic production as a whole, in particularly in distribution, which seems quite easy to fix with a bit of political leadership. So I am by no means the only one to kind of go, what the hell is up with why don't we have rail here in Brazil? Why is there so little of it? It seems it's got something like the 7th largest rail network in the world, but it's also like it's a massive country, and the rail density is something like 1/5 of what China has, 1/6 of what India has. So it seems like such a missed opportunity, especially as there's a whole most of the population is arrayed along the coast rather than in the interior. So connecting that up through rail, both for goods transport and for passenger rail, would seem to be such an open goal. So I was kind of going, why hasn't this happened? Why doesn't this happen? And kind of then started looking into the history, and I thought I was going to tell a story about how rail was followed basically the fast development of Brazil, and then its stagnation and de-development and deindustrialization. And actually what I found was something a little bit different, which is that actually rail was never the kind of leading force in development or national integration. It kind of followed it. So what happened is that you had this big coffee boom in the 1870s. The British came and built railways, but it was all a means of basically getting goods out of the country. And that remains the case until today. So even though the expansion of the rail network was halted by the kind of 1950s and in fact went into decline, the rail network mainly looks like a way of getting raw commodities out to the ports, which speaks to Brazil's dependency, to its deindustrialization, to the failure to live up to the promise that was quite evident to a lot of people in the 1950s, for example. So it's a story about of kind of development not realized, but in a way, it's not like, oh yeah, the railway was leading the way and connecting up places, and it was this big project of national integration in the way that happened in Germany in the 1870s, in the way that happened in the US around the same time. Brazil just didn't go through that process.
So it's almost like once the developments happened, it becomes the following symbol of it. I did have a question for, I guess, both of the two of you, really, which is about the role of highwayism in Brazil. This kind of particular concept, and maybe Alex can answer that. But then, question for both of the two of you, and this is linking back maybe to the labor and logistics. Like, are Brazil and America countries of truckers? Like, is this part of the, I guess, some of the ideological either consequence or cause of this? Because this doesn't, like, this, I don't think this identity is as strong in the UK as Brazil or America. And I wonder what sort of, is this an anti-train ideology? Are the Brits just train guys, going over to Brazil and building all these trains to export, help the coffee leave? But anyway, Alex, on highwayism.
Well, no, I mean, I think, culture follows the built environment here. To be crudely materialist about it, all these things are just products of patterns of development and infrastructure and so on. But it is the case that certain industries or certain forms of infrastructure become, kind of grow roots and become vested interests, right? And this is something that I kind of mentioned in reference to Brazil, that you have a huge dependence on freight. So it's something like 65% of freight in Brazil is by road, which is hugely inefficient. And if you remove iron ore from the equation, iron ore mostly goes by train, and it's maintained by those same mining companies, right? So there's an obvious economic motive for that. But if you remove that, something like 75% gets transported by freight. So there's this like kind of logical sequence where you could go, well, okay, even just within its own terms and within the current context of what the Brazilian economy is, Brazil could improve its rail connections just for the simple purpose of commodity export. It could also go a further step and improve rail connections for freight in general. And then it could start thinking about connecting key hubs. And then think about it, the final stage of building out rail as kind of a form of national integration, as China has done. But even in the narrowest sense that you look at it, there's a lot that isn't being done. And so this was in the news the other day. There was on the way to a port in the state of Pará, in the Amazonian north of the country, massive area, and very what's the opposite of densely populated, sparsely populated. But there was a 445 kilometer back traffic jam to the port with truckers having to spend like 40 hours without food, water, access to a bathroom, and so on, because they were just stuck on the way to the port because it was harvest season for soy, and there's a lack of storage for this stuff. So it all had to be sent to the port at the same time. And, again, all by freight. The roads are not that well paved and should be better paved. And as a consequence, this is a huge cost, even just for industry. Again, looking at it, even in the terms of capital, in capital's own terms, I got this statistic which I was struck by. So to transport from Cuiabá and deep in the interior, this is like real soy and beef country. To transport from there to the port of Santos, Brazil, Latin America's biggest port, it accounts for 70% of the cost of getting goods to Shanghai. So just that bit of the thing is
Wow.
a huge proportion. So 70% getting from Cuiabá to Santos, 30% of getting it from Santos to Shanghai, which is crazy, right? But again, it's like you need the political force and collective will and political leadership to build out alternative forms of transport to compete with road. Otherwise, what ends up happening is that any diversion of capital through taxation or however other means towards building out rail, for example, will come up against the owners of bus companies, the people who build the rail, the roads, and the concessionaries, and the trucking companies, and so on. And I think that's the that's the kind of, I mean, the conclusion that I come to is also, that you just have to kind of build out more, right? So it's not about going like, okay, well, we need to defeat the road people and build out rail. You need intermodal competition. You need to kind of build out as much as possible. And it's something that I think applies quite broadly. This lesson of kind of do more. It's something that has been written about in Damage by Fred Stafford and other people quite often, which is, the very process of building out something of big projects teaches you how to do more. And if you're betting the house on one big thing, I make reference to High Speed 2 in the UK, like where the problem is that the discussion is, from what I can gather, is entirely about High Speed 2, about this one specific rail connection, that then it's very easy to defeat that argument if that thing comes out too costly, takes too long, etc. And you don't learn anything from it. You kind of need to be doing a lot of things at once. But again, that ends up foundering on the basic question of our times, which is how do you drum up political will, and how do you transmit that political will, if formed, upwards through to representative bodies and so on.
Yeah, to call back to Damage's first issue, we called it "Build Big Things," not "Build Big Thing." Which would have been awkward. Now, George, to your question about highwayism, I mean, on the freight side of the equation in the U.S., a lot has to do with the labor question. So after deregulation in the 80s, the Teamsters' domination of trucking really fell off pretty steeply, whereas rail unionization is still pretty high in the U.S. And so I think as a result, trucking just became a lot cheaper. We're at an interesting moment where intermodal shipping is making a comeback. There's just a lot of sensible reasons to send stuff by train rather than by truck. I think the e-commerce revolution has sort of worked against that in a lot of ways, because intermodal tends to be slower, even though it's cheaper. But intermodal is starting to make some gains again. On the passenger side, I would agree with Alex that the attitudes follow the infrastructure. Like if you live in a city with like a workable public transit system, then you're just gonna take it and think of it as reliable. And I do kind of think that there is a kind of if you build it, they will come aspect to trains. America has Amtrak, which is an absolute disaster in so many different ways. Ridership is up on Amtrak in the last year and a half for some reason. Like people like riding Amtrak, even though they understand it to be a disaster, that they know that there's going to be horrible delays. And I think that if you presented the public with a workable passenger rail solution, they would absolutely use it, even though it would take longer, say, to get from San Francisco to LA by train than by plane. There is just something attractive about traveling on the ground in a high-speed train. So I think that something of the romance of trains still sticks around.
Well, and the aviation companies are doing their best to make that point for trains as well. All right. I don't know if we have anything else to add, to articulate to this to this discussion, or if Ben's comment was the caboose of this episode. I think we'll leave that there. Ladies, I'm sure you enjoyed listening to this episode. I assume most of the listeners to this episode were women, because of course chicks dig trains. Everybody knows that.
And logistics.
It's a very feminized area of the world. So thank you for listening, everyone. Ben, thanks for joining us. This has been great. It's been too long, actually, since you've been with the podcast. Let's do it again soon.
Yeah, sounds good.
Excellent. Cheers. Bye-bye.